There is a question humanity has spent centuries trying to answer, one that no philosophy, no religion, and no science has been able to fully resolve. It is the oldest and most urgent question, the one that reappears no matter how much progress we believe we have achieved. The question that inevitably arises when one contemplates the ruins of a bombed city, when one reads the records of an extermination camp, when one understands with that comprehension that cannot be undone once it has occurred, what a human being is capable of doing to another human being. Why does evil exist? Not abstract evil, not evil as a theological concept debated in councils and academies. Concrete, embodied evil, executed with planning and efficiency by people who had a first and last name, who ate breakfast in the mornings, who loved their children, who listened to music, who had gone to school and learned to distinguish right from wrong. The evil that does not come from monsters, because monsters, as we will see, do not exist. The evil that comes from ordinary people, that evil. Carl Jung dedicated decades of his life to this question. He examined it from clinical psychiatry, from comparative mythology, from theology, and from history. And the answer he arrived at was so uncomfortable, so profoundly contrary to what most people want to believe, that even some of his closest colleagues preferred not to follow him to the very end. Because Jung's answer did not point outward, it did not point toward dictators, or psychopaths, or foreign ideologies. It pointed inward. Evil is not in things, Jung wrote. Evil is in the soul of the man who uses them. Today, we are going to descend into that place where Jung dared to go. We are going to examine the problem of evil with the same honesty he demanded, without the comfort of attributing it exclusively to others, without the reassuring illusion that darkness dwells solely in souls fundamentally different from our own. Because if there is one thing depth psychology teaches with absolute and disturbing clarity, it is this: evil is not out there, waiting to attack us from a nature we do not share. Evil is a possibility that lives in every human psyche, and the only difference between the one who embodies it destructively and the one who does not is not a difference in nature. It is, to a large extent, a difference in consciousness. Development 1. The problem that theology could not solve. To understand why Jung had to build a psychology of evil, it is first necessary to understand the problem that Christian theology had left unresolved for centuries, and which Jung knew with a depth that few psychologists of the 20th century could equal. Jung grew up in the heart of a deeply religious family. His father was a Protestant pastor. Several of his uncles were, too. The Bible, theology, and the debates about the nature of God and the devil were not academic abstractions for Jung. They were the air he breathed since childhood, and from very early on, with that relentless honesty that would characterize his entire life. Jung saw in official Christian theology a contradiction that no one seemed to want to name. The problem is called the privatio boni. It is a doctrine formulated by St. Augustine in the 4th century and consolidated by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th, and it establishes that evil does not have a real and autonomous existence. Evil is, in this view, simply the absence of good, in the same way that darkness is the absence of light, or cold is the absence of heat. Evil is not a force, it is not a substance, it is not something that exists in itself, it is a privation, a lack, a void where good should be. This doctrine had a clear and understandable theological function: to protect the omnibenevolence of God. If God is good by definition, and if God created everything that exists, then evil cannot have been created by God, and therefore cannot truly exist as an entity. It is only the absence of what God did create. Jung read this doctrine with the same meticulous attention that a doctor reads a diagnosis he suspects is incorrect, and he found in it what he considered a psychological error with very serious practical consequences. The privatio boni, Jung wrote in Aion, his most dense and controversial work, published in 1951, leaves out of consideration the empirical reality of evil. Whoever has witnessed the real cruelty of human being toward human being knows that evil is not an absence, it is a presence. It has weight, it has shape, it has will. It even has something that can only be called intention. For Jung, the problem was not merely philosophical, but deeply clinical. In decades of working with patients, he had seen firsthand how the denial of evil as a psychic reality, the cultural and religious insistence that deep down everyone is good and that darkness is simply the absence of light, did not produce kinder people. It produced more dangerous people, people whose shadow, denied and rejected and always attributed to external sources, grew in the unconscious until it acquired an autonomy and a force that no conscious effort could contain. The shadow that is not known does not disappear. It finds other paths, paths that its bearer does not see, because he is too busy convincing himself of his own goodness. Good that does not know itself, Jung warned, with one of those phrases that become more disturbing the more you think about them, inevitably becomes the instrument of evil. This was the starting point for the Jung who delved into the problem of evil, not the conviction that humanity is fundamentally perverse, but the exact opposite conviction. Humanity genuinely aspires to the good, and it is precisely that aspiration, when not balanced by an honest knowledge of one's own darkness, that can become the most efficient of alibis for destruction. Development 2. Aion, the darkness at the heart of the symbol. In 1951, Jung published Aion, Contributions to the Symbolism of the Self. It was a book that he himself described as the most difficult he had ever written, and which his editors and many of his colleagues received with a mixture of admiration and perplexity. In it, Jung ventured into a territory that no psychologist had explored with such methodology: the psychological analysis of the figure of Christ and his shadow, the Antichrist, as symbolic representations of the totality of the human psyche and its history. The central argument of Aion can be formulated like this: the symbol of Christ in the Western tradition has functioned for 2,000 years as the symbol of the self, of the deep I, of the totality to which the human psyche aspires in its process of individuation. Christ represents light, goodness, full consciousness, unconditional love, the union of the human and the divine. He is the ideal toward which the Western psyche has oriented its development for 20 centuries. In that sense, his influence has been immense and, in many ways, genuinely transformative. But there is a problem that Jung formulated with a clarity that proves scandalous to many readers and that still provokes resistance today. Christ, as he has been represented in the Orthodox tradition, is a one-sided figure. He is exclusively light. He has no visible shadow. He has no acknowledged darkness. He does not integrate opposites within himself in the way that the true self, the real totality of the psyche, integrates them. He is, in Jungian terms, a representation of the ideal of goodness that has systematically excluded its necessary complement, and an incomplete totality cannot serve as an effective symbol of the real self, because the real self includes everything: light and darkness, goodness and the capacity for destruction, love and rage, creation and dissolution. A symbol that excludes half of psychic reality cannot guide anyone toward genuine individuation. It can only guide toward an increasingly tense one-sidedness, which generates an increasingly burdened collective shadow, which eventually seeks an outlet. For Jung, this explains something that history had demonstrated with a regularity that should have been more instructive to us than it apparently has been: that the eras and cultures most devoutly committed to the Christian ideal of absolute goodness had also produced some of the most extreme episodes of collective violence in human history. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the pogroms, the missionary colonialism that destroyed entire cultures with the sincere conviction of bringing light to the darkness, not as exceptions to the Christian ideal, but as its unintegrated collective shadow. That darkness that had found no place in the conscious symbol and therefore sought an outlet through the least conscious and most destructive channels possible. Jung added to this diagnosis an observation that proved especially difficult to accept: that the figure of the Antichrist in the Christian tradition was not simply the enemy of Christ, but his inevitable psychological shadow, the darkness that the official symbol excluded from its representation of totality, and that the appearance of the Antichrist at the end of times, as described in the Apocalypse, could be read psychologically as the forced eruption of that collective shadow, repressed for far too long. The history of Christianity, Jung wrote with a serenity that made the statement even more striking, is to a large extent the history of its unrecognized shadow. This was not, for Jung, a critique of Christian spirituality in itself, nor a denial of the values that this tradition has contributed to Western culture. It was a psychological diagnosis regarding the consequences of one-sidedness. The problem was not the aspiration to goodness. It was the denial of the darkness that this aspiration carried with it as an unexamined consequence. Development 3. The Milgram experiment. Obedience as an instrument of evil. Jung died in 1961. That same year, the social psychologist Stanley Milgram began a series of experiments at Yale University that would confirm, with an empirical precision Jung could not have had, some of his most disturbing intuitions about the nature of ordinary evil. The Milgram experiment is today one of the best known and most cited in the history of psychology. In its basic design, a volunteer participant was instructed by a researcher in a white coat to administer electrical shocks of increasing intensity to another person who was supposedly in the adjacent room. The task appeared to be research on learning. Every time that person made a mistake on a memory test, the participant was to push the lever up to the next level. The levels ranged from 15 volts, labeled as slight, to 450 volts, labeled first as danger, severe shock, and finally, the last 3 levels, simply as XX. The person in the adjacent room was actually an actor. He received no shock, but the participant did not know that. And what Milgram discovered was something that permanently changed the psychological understanding of evil. 65% of the participants, normal people with no history of violence or cruelty, people who in any ordinary context of their lives would be described by their neighbors as good people, went all the way to the maximum level of shock. They went up to 450 volts, even when they heard screams of pain through the wall, even when the voice in the next room begged them to stop, even when that voice stopped responding altogether. They went all the way to the end simply because the researcher in the white coat kept telling them, with calmness and institutional authority, please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. Milgram called this phenomenon the agentic state, that psychological state in which a person yields their sense of personal moral responsibility to an authority figure and begins to act as an instrument rather than as an autonomous agent. In the agentic state, people do not feel that they are the ones making the decisions. They feel they are only obeying. They feel they are the channel for a will that is not their own. And that feeling of not being the real agent of the action completely disconnects the moral brake that under ordinary circumstances would stop them. The implication was devastating. Mass evil does not require evil people. It only requires authority structures convincing enough and people disconnected enough from their own moral judgment for obedience to replace conscience. Jung had articulated it differently, but it was essentially the same diagnosis. When the ego dissolves into the collective, when the person loses contact with their own moral center because they have delegated that center to an institution, a leader, or an ideology that thinks, for them, the collective shadow can operate through them without encountering any inner resistance. There is no one home to say no. Hannah Arendt, the German philosopher who covered the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, reached a philosophical conclusion that complements Milgram's psychological one. Eichmann, the logistical organizer of the Holocaust, the man who coordinated the deportation of millions of people to extermination camps, was not a monster. He was not a sadist. He felt no particular hatred for his victims. He was, in Arendt's description, someone terrifyingly normal, a mediocre, obedient bureaucrat, incapable of independent thought, who executed orders with the efficiency of a civil servant who does not want any trouble. Arendt called this the banality of evil, the idea that the most devastating evil in history was not the work of beings exceptional in their perversity, but of ordinary people who had given up thinking, who had given up exercising the only act that would have stopped them, the act of making moral judgments on their own. Jung would have added one more layer. The people who had given up thinking were precisely those who had also given up knowing their own shadow. They had not done the inner work of confronting their own darkness. And that is why, when darkness arrived from the outside in the form of ideology, of authority, of collective permission, of a structure that absolved them of individual responsibility, it met no resistance. It found an empty channel, ready to be used. Development 4. Nazi Germany and collective psychosis. No example in recent history illustrates Jung's theory of evil more clearly than Nazi Germany, and Jung knew it and said it with an intellectual courage that cost him dearly in terms of reputation for decades. He wrote about it since the 1930s, when many of his contemporaries still preferred not to see what was being methodically built in Central Europe. In 1936, 3 years after Hitler came to power, Jung published an essay titled Wotan, in which he attempted to psychologically understand what was happening in Germany. His analysis was extraordinarily unpopular. and in some ways, it was misinterpreted in ways that would accompany his reputation for decades. But its psychological core was precise, and seen from today, proves prophetic. Jung observed that what was happening in Germany was not simply a political or economic phenomenon. Although it had political and economic dimensions that no honest analysis could ignore, it was fundamentally a psychological phenomenon of massive proportions, what Jung called a collective possession by an archetype of the collective unconscious. The German people had suffered in the previous 20 years an accumulation of psychological traumas of extraordinary intensity. A humiliating defeat in the First World War, a peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, designed not to reconcile, but to humiliate. An economic crisis that wiped out the savings of an entire middle class in a matter of months. A profound loss of collective identity and sense of place in the world. All of this had created in the German collective psyche a state of vulnerability, unresolved tension, and repressed energy that desperately sought a channel of expression. In Jungian terms, the German collective shadow, all that accumulated aggression, all that unprocessed humiliation, all that rage that had not found legitimate or conscious channels of expression, was fully charged and seeking an explosion. And when the social structures containing that energy began to disintegrate under the pressure of the crisis, the shadow erupted. What erupted found in the figure of Hitler an exceptional bearer, not because Hitler was a genius or an exceptional being, but for precisely the opposite reason, because he was empty enough, lacking enough in content of his own, to become the perfect receptacle for collective projection. Millions of people projected onto him their unrecognized grandiosity, their yearning for redemption, their desire for a father to protect them, and an enemy to explain their suffering. Jung wrote something that is disturbing precisely because it is lucid and leaves no comfortable escape. Hitler is the mirror of every German. He shows what every German carries inside, or at least what a part of every German carries inside. Not as an exoneration of any individual responsibility, not as an assertion that all Germans were equally guilty, but as a warning about the psychological mechanisms that make massive participation in evil possible when the collective shadow has not been integrated. And here is the question that is most difficult to sustain without looking away, not the question about Hitler or the SS officers, the question about ordinary people. How was it possible that millions of ordinary people who loved their families, who went to church, who had perfectly normal lives, actively participated in or silently let pass one of the most documented and visible crimes in human history? Jung's answer is not comfortable, but it is necessary, because those ordinary people had not done the work of confronting their own darkness. They lived in the illusion of their own goodness, and that illusion did not protect them from evil. It prepared them for it. Because whoever does not know their own capacity for cruelty is exactly the one who can most easily be used as its instrument, precisely because they do not recognize themselves in what they are doing. He who makes his shadow conscious, Jung insisted time and again, is the one who is most difficult to mobilize toward collective evil. Not because he is better than the others, but because he knows himself. Development 5, the Book of Job, when human consciousness confronts God. In 1952, 1 year after Aion, Jung published a work that he himself described as the most personal and the most risky of his entire career. A work that, as he confessed in private letters, he felt had been written through him rather than by him. He titled it, Answer to Job. The Book of Job is one of the oldest and most disturbing texts in the Bible, probably originating before the people of Israel themselves, absorbed into the Hebrew canon by the irresistible force of its honesty. The Book of Job bluntly poses the question that no theodicy has been able to answer completely satisfactorily. How can unjust suffering exist if God is omnipotent and good? Job is a just, upright man with no identifiable moral flaw, and yet God allows Satan to destroy him systematically. He takes away his children in a single day, his wealth, his health, his body. Job lies on the ground covered in sores, and his friends, who represent the theological orthodoxy of his time, patiently explain to him that he must surely have sinned in some way he cannot remember, because otherwise this could not be happening to him. And Job does something extraordinary for the religious sensibility of his culture. He does not accept the explanation. He does not renounce his innocence. He does not capitulate to the theological pressure of his friends. He demands that God answer. He demands an audience. He demands that the injustice be named for what it is. Jung read this text not as a theologian, but as a psychologist of the great collective symbols. And what he saw was something few readers before him had been willing to see. In the book of Job, for the first time in the biblical tradition, God is confronted with the consequences of his own darkness. Job acts as a mirror that reflects back to God an image of himself that God cannot ignore. And that confrontation has consequences. The boldest conclusion of Answer to Job can be formulated like this. At the moment of the book of Job, the moral consciousness of a human being, Job, surpasses in clarity and ethical demand the image that this human being has of God. Job knows that what is happening to him is unjust. God, in the story, acts from absolute power without regard for justice. And it is Job's insistence on naming that injustice, his refusal to accept the comfortable version that his friends offer him, that eventually produces the transformation. For Jung, this had a psychological significance of the highest magnitude that went far beyond biblical analysis. The text of Job described, in mythical and religious language, the same process that Jung had observed in his patients, the moment when moral consciousness confronts the unconscious, when the person dares to demand an accounting from the darkness that inhabits them, when the ego ceases to be a passive victim of its own shadow and becomes its active interlocutor, the agent of its transformation. The answer to Job given by the biblical text is, at first glance, disconcerting. God answers Job from the whirlwind with a series of questions about the incomprehensible vastness of creation. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Can you bind the Pleiades or loosen the cords of Orion? It is not an answer to Job's question about justice. It is the revelation of a totality that transcends the moral categories of the human being. And yet, in the end, God tells Job's friends that they did not speak what is right about him, as Job did. Those who defended the comfortable theological orthodoxy were wrong. Job, who dared to demand the truth, was right. Job, Jung wrote in Answer to Job, represents the moment when human consciousness surpasses in moral maturity the image that the human being has of God. And it is precisely that overcoming, that refusal to accept the darkness without naming it, that forces the divine symbol to evolve toward a greater consciousness. This was the boldest statement of Jung's entire career, and the one that earned him the most criticism from religious circles. But for Jung, it was not theology. It was the psychology of the collective unconscious. It was the recognition that our images of the divine are also projections of our collective psyche, and that when those images are one-sided, when we project only light onto the sacred, and deny the darkness, the denied darkness finds its own paths of expression, always. Development 6. Evil as an autonomous psychic reality. One of Jung's most original and challenging contributions to the problem of evil, and the one that is most difficult for modern sensibility, is his insistence that evil is not simply an error in behavior. It is not simply the result of poor socioeconomic conditions. It is not simply the theological absence of good. Evil is an autonomous psychic reality. It has its own energy, its own internal logic, its own capacity to act independently of the individual's conscious will. Jung called it the archetype of the shadow and its collective dimension, a content of the collective unconscious, that layer of the psyche that does not belong to the individual but is shared by all humanity, which has no personal owner, but can be activated in any individual, especially under conditions of ego weakening, intense collective pressure, loss of personal identity, or a crisis of meaning. This view has consequences that are equally uncomfortable for the traditional religious perspective and for the secular rationalist perspective, which are the two great contemporary ways of thinking about evil. For the traditional religious perspective, it implies that evil cannot simply be attributed to Satan as an external force and exercised through rituals or faith. It lives in the human psyche and requires being confronted from the inside, not from the outside. For the secular rationalist perspective, which trusts that the progress of education, democratic institutions, and material conditions will solve the problem of evil, it implies something equally uncomfortable, that evil has roots in the collective unconscious, that no institutional reform can reach directly, that the Enlightenment was right in its diagnoses about superstition and tyranny, but was naively optimistic in its conviction that reason alone could solve the problem of human darkness. The 20th century, with its 2 world wars, its genocides, its left-wing and right-wing totalitarianisms, all of them executed in the name of ideals that their perpetrators considered genuinely luminous, was the most brutal empirical refutation of that enlightened optimism. The American philosopher Rollo May, who knew Jung's work well, formulated it with a clarity that is impossible to ignore. The demon is not outside. The demon is the energy that is released when a person loses contact with their own moral center. It is not an external force that invades the human being. It is an internal force that takes control when the human being stops exercising their own. And this explains the historical pattern that should have taught us more than it has. That the ideological systems that most intensely proclaim their dedication to the good, that present themselves as the representatives of light against the forces of darkness, are exactly the ones most prone to producing atrocities, because the intensity with which the good is proclaimed is frequently directly proportional to the intensity with which the shadow is denied. And the denied shadow always finds a way out. Always distrust those who speak too much about the light, Jung wrote. The darkness they have not looked at is right behind them. Development 7. Dostoevsky and the Psychology of Crime. No writer in the history of Western literature has explored the psychology of evil with greater depth, greater honesty, and greater compassion than Fyodor Dostoevsky. And Jung knew this. He returned to him time and again in his published texts, in his seminars, in his private conversations. He considered him not just a writer, but a psychologist of the soul, someone who had seen what science took decades to articulate. Dostoevsky knew evil from the inside with that familiarity that can only come from having truly touched it. At 28 years old, he was arrested for political activity, tried, sentenced to death, and taken to a snowy courtyard in St. Petersburg, where the firing squad readied their rifles. He stood waiting in the snow, chained, while the soldiers took aim, and at the last moment, when the volley already seemed inevitable, the messenger arrived with a pardon from the Tsar. The death penalty was commuted to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia. That experience changed him in a way that no ordinary life experience can change anyone. It gave him access to a knowledge about the human condition, about what remains in a human being when all social constructs and all pretense have been stripped away, that very few writers have ever had. In Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov, a young student in St. Petersburg living in the most humiliating poverty, develops a philosophical theory that allows him to justify the murder of an old female pawnbroker. His reasoning is elaborate, internally coherent, and, from his own logic, impeccable. The great men of history, Napoleon, Caesar, Alexander the Great, all transgressed ordinary moral law on their path to their goals. If there is a class of men who are above ordinary law because their mission justifies them, and if he, Raskolnikov, belongs to that class, then the murder of a useless, parasitic old woman is not only justified, but is a kind of act of social hygiene. What Dostoevsky shows, with a precision that anticipated decades of clinical psychology, is the exact mechanics of the rationalization of evil, that intellectual construct through which a human being turns their destructive impulse into a moral argument. Raskolnikov is not an evil man who knows he is evil. He is a person who has built a system of thought sophisticated enough to convince himself that the evil he is about to commit is, in reality, a greater good. He has projected his own shadow, his own need for power, his own rage in the face of humiliation onto the old woman. He has turned her into the obstacle, into the leech, into the symbol of everything that oppresses him. And by doing so, he has erased the humanity of the victim from his vision. The old woman is no longer a person. She is a problem, and problems get eliminated. Jung would recognize in this process the classic projection of the shadow, the inability to see the other as a whole being, because that other has been turned into the receptacle for everything the self cannot recognize within itself. The cruelty of the other that justifies one's own cruelty, the evil of the other that sanctifies one's own evil. But Dostoevsky does not end with the crime. Because what Crime and Punishment demonstrates with relentless insistence is the impossibility of escaping one's own moral conscience. Raskolnikov commits the murder, and then he discovers that his theory was completely false, not because someone proves it to him intellectually, but because his own psyche proves it to him viscerally, in a way that no argument can counter. The insomnia, the fever, the hallucinations, the unbearable paranoia, the inability to function normally. The shadow he projected outward in order to act returns inward with a force that no philosophy can stop. Conscience, Dostoevsky wrote in his notebooks, is the reaction of the soul to the violation of its own nature. It cannot be silenced by any philosophy, because it is not philosophical, it is psychological. It is the voice of the true self that knows, always knows, what is being done. Jung would have said exactly the same thing with a different vocabulary. Moral conscience is not an arbitrary cultural construct. It is a function of the self, of the deepest center of the psyche, which responds to the violation of totality with symptoms that cannot be ignored indefinitely. The shadow can be projected, but projection does not eliminate it. Projection only postpones the encounter. And when the encounter happens, it generally happens with greater force than if it had been faced from the beginning. Development 8. The problem of responsibility. To understand is not to excuse. There is a risk in the Jungian psychology of evil that must be honestly named, because otherwise it can become an instrument of moral evasion itself. If evil has roots in the collective unconscious that no one chose to have, if every human being carries the seed of darkness, if the perpetrator is on some level also a victim of psychological forces that transcend him, where does individual responsibility lie? Does the psychological understanding of evil not become a sophisticated alibi to avoid judging and sanctioning it? Jung was absolutely explicit on this point, and it is important not to misinterpret his position. Understanding the psychological roots of evil is not equivalent to excusing it. It is precisely the opposite. A deep understanding of how evil works, of what internal and external mechanisms make it possible, of what conditions of unconsciousness facilitate it, is the most solid foundation that exists for real moral responsibility. Because superficial responsibility, the kind that condemns without understanding, that points a finger without looking, that distinguishes between the good and the bad with the reassuring certainty of belonging to the first group, produces social outrage, but not transformation. The individual must ruthlessly know how much good he can do and what crimes he is capable of committing, Jung wrote. This sentence summarizes his position on responsibility with a precision that leaves no escape. It is not an invitation to self-complacency. It is not an invitation to self-flagellation. It is an invitation to radical self-knowledge, knowing oneself honestly enough to know what one is capable of in both directions, and assuming full responsibility for that capacity. The writer and Holocaust survivor Primo Levi articulated something similar from a perspective that could only come from someone who had lived the experience from the inside, from the body, from the hunger and the cold, and the systematic humiliation. In If This Is a Man, Levi describes what he called the gray zone, that blurry moral territory in which the victims of the extermination camps were sometimes forced to become instruments of the very system that destroyed them. The Sonderkommandos who operated the crematorium ovens, the capos who supervised other prisoners with brutality to maintain their own minimal privileges, those who collaborated in order to survive one more day. Levi does not condemn them easily. He examines them. He understands them. He understands the logic of survival that pushed them. And by doing so, he does something infinitely more difficult and more necessary than condemning them. He keeps them within the human realm, which forces the reader to ask the question that Levi wanted to be asked, the question that no one wants to ask themselves and me. Under those conditions, with that level of hunger and fear and systematic degradation, what would I have done? That is Jung's question, and it is the most uncomfortable one that exists. Not because the answer is necessarily that one would have collaborated with evil, but because honesty demands admitting that one does not know, that the line between the hero and the accomplice, between the martyr and the collaborator, is thinner than peacetime thinking allows us to imagine, and that this uncertainty is not an invitation to despair, but to humility, to the only humility that produces true courage, the one that knows its own fragility. Development 9. The integration of evil. The path that is not surrender. What then does Jungian psychology do with evil? What does it concretely propose beyond diagnosis? Jung's answer is not the elimination of evil, which he considered impossible because it denied the nature of the psyche, nor is it surrender to it, which would be capitulation without a fight. It is something that is more difficult to formulate, but, once understood, more profoundly transformative, the conscious integration of the capacity for evil. This needs to be explained carefully, because it easily lends itself to misunderstandings that can be dangerous. To integrate the capacity for evil does not mean acting from it. It does not mean yielding to destructive impulses under the pretext of psychological authenticity. It does not mean that everything is permitted because we all carry darkness. It means exactly the opposite. It means knowing that capacity with enough clarity and honesty to be able to consciously choose not to act from it, because one can only truly choose not to do something if one knows one is capable of doing it. The virtue that does not know temptation is not virtue. It is simply ignorance of one's own possibilities. Jung often used the image of the doctor and poisons. A doctor who knows poisons, who knows exactly what they do to the organism, who has worked with them enough to understand their logic, is not more dangerous than one who ignores them. He is safer, precisely because he knows what he is working with. The person who knows their own capacity for cruelty, for envy, for betrayal, for destruction, is not more destructive than the one who denies it. They are safer, precisely because that capacity is in their visual field and under their conscious supervision. Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people, Jung wrote. And he added, on another occasion, with one of those formulations that become increasingly revealing the more you think about them: those who pretend not to have a shadow do no good. They only help to build hell with good intentions. The process of integrating the shadow, including its dimension as a capacity for evil, is part of the process Jung called individuation, that movement toward the totality of the personality that lasts a lifetime and is never fully completed. It is not a state that is reached, but a movement that is sustained. It is not a problem that is solved, but a practice that is continued. And that movement, sustained with honesty and courage over the years, produces something that has consequences going far beyond the individual. It produces people who are harder to mobilize by the collective forces of darkness, people who cannot easily be turned into instruments of evil because they know themselves deeply enough to recognize when they are being tempted, when they are rationalizing, and when ideology, authority, or fear is substituting their own moral judgment. People who have learned what Raskolnikov learned too late, that there is no escape from one's own conscience, that the real self, beneath all the layers of rationalization, knows exactly what is happening, and that the only way not to become the instrument of evil is to not pretend to be the exception to it. The question we cannot stop asking ourselves: we have reached the moment that this journey has been preparing for since the very first sentence. If evil is not only out there, if it also lives in the psyche of every human being as a real possibility, not as a theological abstraction, but as a concrete and active energy. If the difference between the perpetrator and the silent witness is not always a difference in nature, but frequently a difference in circumstances, in collective pressure, in authority structures, in how much or how little one knew oneself at the decisive moment, then the question Jung leaves us with is not how to judge the wicked. The question is this: what part of the darkness you condemn in the world also exists in you? Not as a question of paralyzing collective guilt, not as an invitation to moral equivalence that erases the real differences between perpetrators and victims, but as the most serious and necessary question that a human being can ask themselves if they want to live with integrity in a world where evil remains possible, remains real, and continues to seek new channels in every generation, because the human psyche does not change as fast as the ideologies that express it. Dostoevsky wrote in The Brothers Karamazov, in one of the monologues of the Starets Zosima, one of the most profound sentences in all of Russian literature: we are all responsible for everyone and everything, not in the sense of a collective guilt that paralyzes, but in the sense of a shared responsibility born from the recognition that what is human, in all its greatness and all its darkness, is carried by all of us, that there is no one, anywhere, whose suffering or whose fall is completely alien to what we all share. Jung formulated it with the vocabulary of psychology, but he pointed to the exact same place. Whoever has not confronted their own shadow has no right to claim innocence in the face of the evil of the world, because the evil of the world feeds exactly on that unexamined innocence. The path Jung proposes is not the path of moral perfection. It is not the path of one who has eliminated the darkness from within, because that path does not exist. It is the path of one who knows it, of one who can look at it without fleeing or surrendering, of one who has learned to bring the darkness into the light, not to celebrate it, but to strip it of its most dangerous power, the power to act in the shadows, without being seen, without being named, without being recognized for what it is. There is no light without shadow, Jung wrote, and no psychic wholeness without imperfection. Wholeness is not the absence of darkness. Wholeness is darkness known, integrated, and transformed into depth instead of destruction, into wisdom instead of violence, into compassion toward human fragility, one's own and that of others, instead of the indignation that condemns without looking at itself. That is, ultimately, the only real antidote that depth psychology has found for humanity's oldest question. Not the goodness that denies the darkness, but the totality that contains it. Jung used to say that the problem of evil can only be addressed honestly from within, never from the comfort of pointing outward with the certainty that one is safe. Before you close this video, just one question. Is there any aspect of your own patterns, of your own reactions, of something you do or fail to do, that you prefer not to examine too closely? It doesn't have to be anything dramatic. Often, the most important darknesses are not dramatic. They are small, everyday, consistent. Tell us in the comments if you feel up to it, or simply keep the question with you. Those who have made it this far already know that this channel does not exist to make the inner life more comfortable, but to make it more real. And reality, as Jung never tired of reminding us, is always richer, more complex, and in the end, more liberating than any illusion of innocence. In the next video, we are going to explore the psychology of death and what Jung discovered about the only transformation that no human being can evade, and what that transformation reveals about how we live. If this video made you uncomfortable in the right way, the next one is going to take you even further.